Right, well, let's begin, modest numbers though there are this week. First, welcome. This week we're going to hear about select committees. Now, select committees we've touched against once before, or more than once before actually, but particularly when Professor George Jones, who is our speaker this afternoon, was previously here to talk about Parliament. Select committees have been a major innovation in the last 30 years in the UK parliamentary system, and we'll hear a bit more about that this afternoon from Professor Jones, who has very particular views about select committees, about which we will hear now. George Jones.
Thank you, Tony. What I'm going to focus on is mainly departmental select committees, 18 of them. There are other select committees, but they aren't focused on a single department. There's the Public Accounts Committee that checks up that departments are spending money as Parliament intended, and there's the Public Administration Committee whose focus is on the civil service in all departments. My focus is very much on these departmental select committees. And you'll recall the House as a whole, 650 MPs. On each committee there's 11 members only. Now, 25 years ago, I wrote an article in the Times attacking the system of departmental select committees that had been established 10 years earlier in 1979. And I think 2015, it's interesting for me to revisit my article and its objections to departmental select committees. I deplored their establishment. I'd be interested to see if my arguments are still relative and whether my predictions were accurate. Well, let's look first at the history of select committees. During the 18th and 19th centuries, select committees were used sporadically from time to time to conduct inquiries into specific issues of concern. Only one of those became a permanent feature, the Public Accounts Committee, set up in 1861 to examine not policy, but the way policy was implemented to ensure that taxpayers' money had been spent as Parliament intended. There was no development before 1979 of a select committee system shadowing government departments because of the emergence of the cabinet and party government within the principles established by the 1688 constitutional settlement. The whole House was seen as the place for debating policy, and the House regarded itself as a unity of equal MPs and was always rather reluctant to delegate policy to small groups of MPs. And that was the view of leaders of the House like R.A. Butler and Herbert Morrison, and those two lovers of Parliament, Michael Foot and Enoch Powell. The latter two were opposed to the non-adversarial approach of select committees, which they feared would blunt the force of debate between the two competing parties. They felt members of one party would become too cosy with members of the other. Now, the views that I expressed in my 1989 article, and still do, so you've got the conclusion now, are in their tradition, the Morrison-Butler tradition. And they reflect an examination I made of debates in Hansard when proposals were made to introduce select committees, departmental select committees. And I articulate the views of most past leaders of the House before the 1960s. Now, I'm not playing the part of a curmudgeonly devil's advocate. I've obviously been influenced much by the views of Herbert Morrison, whose biography I co-wrote. He opposed select committees because he feared they would undermine an elected government from carrying out the programme it had been elected to deliver. He wrote they would tend to increase the opportunities of the House of Commons to intervene, to amend, to criticise, and to consume time and administrative effort. Such a view is deeply etched still today in the culture of the whips officers. A more academic assessment of what I just said is that of Alexandra Kelso. The paper will come round to you eventually, tomorrow sometime, with the full references and sources. And I do commend Alexandra Kelso's study. She noted that we have an executive that has historically resisted such innovations. Well, as we'll see in more recent years, the executive has capitulated. Now, my article's focus was on the then 14 departmental select committees, now 18, established in 1979 by Mrs. Thatcher's leader of the House of Commons, Norman St John Stevens. They were given wide terms of reference, still basically the terms of reference today. They are to examine the expenditure, administration and policy of the principal government departments and their associated bodies, that is, appointed boards and quangos. The establishment of this system reflected a blinkered view of the place of the House of Commons in the British Constitution. Champions of departmental select committees saw the main role of the Commons as a check on government. They felt the executive, the government, had grown too strong, and there was a need to strengthen the Commons as a counterweight. They totally forgot that most MPs had been elected to support the governing party and its policies. Now, for some years before 1979, departmental select committees had been proposed as this counterweight by clerks of the Commons, the permanent officials who serve Parliament. And in the 1950s and 60s, by a growing number of academics who studied Parliament. There was an influential, modernising book written by Professor Bernard Crick, then at Sheffield, called The Reform of Parliament, supportive of select committees. In 1964, a joint research group of clerks and academics called the Study of Parliament Group was founded, which became very much a lobby for select committees. And then much later, around the turn of the century, and really up to now, 3 other think tanks have been very supportive of select committees. There's the Hansard Society, the Constitution Unit of University College London, and the Institute for Government. They've all held conferences and produced publications very much in favour of departmental select committees, indeed of expanding their role. Well, back to 1979, setting up a system of departmental select committees was one of the earliest decisions of the Thatcher government, pushed through cabinet by St John Stevens, before ministers had had experience of being ministers, and while they were too absorbed in their departmental portfolios to realise the significance of what they were doing. Mrs. Thatcher saw them as a way for MPs to get a grip on the civil service, exposing and cutting out their waste and extravagance. And they fitted her more general vision of the need to roll back the state. Now, I wrote in the Times article that St John Stevens, an admirer of Walter Bagehot, editor of his diaries, was imbued with nostalgia for the mid-Victorian age, when party loyalties were looser and governments were at the mercy of fluctuating majorities in the Commons. For him, it was a matter of back to Bagehot and running with a fashionable fad of academia. Such select committees had also been suggested by the House of Commons Procedure Committee just before the general election of 1979. And there were some party managers who felt, well, they'd occupy the time of the new MPs and some of the old ones too, and divert them away from plotting and causing trouble for the government. Ministers found themselves lumbered with them, and having had experience of them, most of them would have let them wither. But too many backbenchers liked them. They gave them something to do. Now, the committees proved attractive, particularly for certain types of MP. In my analysis, I've expanded it a bit as to who are the interests supporting these select committees. Well, in Parliament, those MPs who were, if you like, inexperienced newcomers who wanted to learn about government, apprentices, I call them. There are those disappointed at not being in government, both the dejected has-beens who'd been dismissed as ministers because they weren't up to it, and disgruntled never-will-be's unappointable for various reasons. Some opposition backbenchers spotted in these select committees an opportunity to embarrass the government. And those who were tied to certain lobbies and sectional groups seeking a platform welcomed them too. There were dissenters with axes to grind, permanent rebels. And of course there were those with nothing else useful to do with their time. And much later, in the last few years, some MPs wanting to supplement their salaries, as well as using membership of select committees as an opportunity to gain a media reputation as what's so often called an influential backbencher. What about the champions outside the Commons? They were, and still are, most of my academic colleagues and their students who've been provided with new institutions and processes to examine and opportunities to act as advisors and researchers for the select committees. There are the clerks of the House who have enjoyed enhanced career opportunities as committee secretaries, servicing the committees, and their chairman, serving the chairman too, and exercising influence in helping to choose witnesses and to write the reports, often the first draft. Thirdly, there are pressure groups, generally, which have been delighted to have new opportunities to inject their views into the policy process and gain publicity for their causes. And fourthly, journalists, they've welcomed the clashes that have occurred between the committees and the witnesses they examine, whether it's ministers they're grilling or others in position of responsibility in the public and private sectors. So that's the alliance of the supporters of select committees. Now, from their establishment in 1979 as a system of departmental select committees, they have in fits and starts increased their powers, status, scope and role. Two key stages occurred in this apparently inexorable rise. First, 2002, when their original terms of reference, you recall, focusing on policy, administration and expenditure, were widened into what were called sets of core tasks and objectives. And these tasks and objectives were later revised 10 years later, 2012. But at each of those widening exercises, they were all still within the basic framework of the 1979 objectives. And then their rise was very much sustained in 2010 when their chairs and members became elected by the MPs rather than selected by the whips, thus weakening control by the government over them. Now, there are two sides in this debate. Alexandra Kelso says they're in diametrical opposition. One side, which is mine, sees the key concepts of parliamentary sovereignty, ministerial responsibility and party government as gearing the Commons towards facilitating strong government. The other side believes the primary function of the House of Commons is to act as an effective check upon the executive and its actions. By 2010, the start of this present government, the latter seem to have won. And I think that's the position today. Some select committees have extended their activities to include demanding the right to hold hearings on the government's proposed appointments to certain official positions. In my mind, such appointments should be matters for the executive only. It should be able to choose whom it wants to run governmental organisations and further its policies. Some select committees seek to conduct investigations into all draft bills, transforming themselves from committees of scrutiny into legislative committees, perhaps even supplanting the public bill committees, or at least covering the same ground. Generally, when I look at what the committees get up to, they seem to me taken over by a frenzy of hyper-activity. I wonder how members can find time for the other activities of MPs, which I referred to in my lecture last term. What are the defects? I argued in 1989, and still do, that departmental select committees have not been of benefit to good government. Their terms of reference are too wide. They have no sharp focus or discipline to guide their investigations. They dissipate their energies on too many inquiries on too many disparate topics. Some pursue hobby horses of their chairman or of particular members. Some chase hares started by civil servants or pressure groups. Some go for subjects they know will provoke a confrontation with ministers or some outside group and attract headline publicity. Well, let me list the 9 most glaring defects. First, most have not concentrated on conducting searching inquiries into departments' administrative, financial and expenditure activities of civil servants. Most MPs are not interested in the hard grind of inquiring into public administration and public expenditure. Some turn their attention away from departments to investigate other parts of the public sector, public corporations and local authorities, and even private sector organisations. I suspect that civil servants have appreciated this diversion of select committee investigations away from them onto these other bodies that aren't part of government. Second, they've involved themselves in policy issues. I referred in the article to the future of Trident. Well, that'll be an issue again. And the other one was the banning of trade union membership at GCHQ, the spy headquarters in Cheltenham. More recently, in September 2013, the Treasury Select Committee was critical of a deal made by the Treasury with Chinese bankers to enable Chinese banks to operate wholesale lending branches in the UK, a matter of government policy. I wrote that in 1989 that such inquiries delving into politically charged topics go against the grain of the Constitution. It's illogical to have one group of the most senior parliamentarians setting policy in their departments and through cabinet and cabinet committees, and another group of only between, 9 and 11 MPs, and in practice, when you go along, fewer, harassing the government and expecting to be recognised as authoritative. Select committees have seemed to revel in challenging government policy, even propounding their own as superior. They act as a rival government to the real government. And another more recent intrusion into the policy of government was in late 2014, when the Foreign Affairs Select Committee sought to question in Hong Kong the leaders of protest groups, as if the United Kingdom had a continuing responsibility for the way Hong Kong is governed. It had given that up in 1997, and the actions of this Select Committee threatened to disrupt diplomatic relations between the UK and China. Number 3, the way select committees operate inspires little confidence. You get small, floating groups of MPs asking often haphazard questions. They're briefed by generalist committee clerks or some so-called expert advisors recruited through a personal recommendation, usually. And there's a similarly oddly chosen bunch of opinionated witnesses who appear to give evidence, often as spokesmen or women of established sectional interests. A first draft report is usually written by the clerk to an impossibly tight timetable. Now, they can obtain help from the scrutiny unit, 14 staff set up in November 2002, which focus mainly on legal and financial advice. Now, such select committee processes are not appropriate for conducting balanced and authoritative policy analysis. At LSE, we wouldn't think of setting up such arrangements to, if one was engaged in a project of policy analysis. Fourth, select committees have enhanced the influence of sectional groups, and they've encouraged the proliferation of professional lobbying organisations because they've provided new opportunities and platforms for special interests to promote their campaigns. The policy-making process has become distorted. Those parts of government which try to balance priorities and have a concern for the wise use of resources have not been strengthened to meet the increased pressure from those lobbying for their particular projects and causes. The policy process is unbalanced and damaging to the public interest. Fifth, some have behaved like kangaroo courts, treating witnesses as if they were criminals to be summoned at their will and grilled without any of the protections usually available to witnesses in a real court. Now, this phenomenon was first vividly illustrated in January 1992. This is when I trace the first step in this process. It was when the brothers Ian and Kevin Maxwell were called before the Social Security Select Committee to face fierce questioning about the millions missing from their companies and their fathers' pension funds. Now, since then, a variety of other private citizens have been subjected to harassment by select committees. Most prominently, July 2011, when Rupert Murdoch and his son James and other News Corporation's executives, editors and journalists were brought before them with accusations of phone hacking. In January 2000, the grilling of 5 executives of tobacco companies prompted Quentin Letts, who writes about what goes on in Parliament in the Daily Mail. He wrote, "Had I been one of the tobacco executives, I think I would probably have walked out." In January 2004, 5 heads of insurance companies appeared before the Treasury Select Committee, provoking a headline in the Times, "5 in the head study for 6 of the best." More recently, bankers, investment executives, heads of payday loan companies, and executives of energy supply companies, all in the private sector, have received similar treatment. In May 2014, bosses of the pharmaceutical company Pfizer appeared before the Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee for what the Times called a humiliation session. On October the 23rd, 2013, 3 chief constables came before the Home Affairs Committee about an investigation they had conducted in the Plebgate affair. The chief constables shouldn't be accountable to select committees. They were called before the committee because of press and public concern, and because the chair of the committee, Keith Vaz, liked to attract publicity. He is known as an MP who is never slow to jump on a passing bandwagon. Now, had these witnesses been called to give evidence about how government policy and administration were affecting the running of their firms and organisations, then there would have been a justifiable case for their appearance before select committees. But they shouldn't have been held responsible and made accountable to Commons committees for the way they were running their businesses and organisations that were not part of the government or one of its offshoots. The 6th defect: select committees have played a role in diminishing the reputations of ministers. Select committee chairmen now often attract more media coverage than do junior ministers. The former are more well known than the latter. Select committees have intervened in functions that are essentially ministerial and governmental, like trying to veto the appointment of its advisors and chairs of boards in pre-appointment sessions, and demanding the attendance of special advisors who administer nothing, but they give only advice, and now since 2010, assistance to ministers. They don't run anything. And worst of all, as you haven't had a lecture from me on the Prime Minister, but worst of all to me, the Liaison Committee, consisting of chairs of the select committees. They've dragged Prime Ministers Blair, Brown and Cameron before it twice a year, although they have few statutory and executive responsibilities. The Liaison Committee seemed to assume that the Prime Minister could answer about any department, and they've thus contributed to the presidentialisation of British government. 7, the criticism much heard before 1979 was that select committees would weaken the full chamber by distracting MPs from attending there and from performing the other roles of MPs that I outlined last term in favour of committee work. Time is the scarcest resource of an MP. Many can hardly keep up with the demands on their time. The more they're engaged in select committee work, which has grown since 1979, the less time and energy they have for their other parliamentary activities. The frequently empty benches in the chamber show that most MPs are somewhere else. Probably, I suspect, preparing for their committees or attending them. Now, this criticism was much enhanced in the final year of this Parliament because of the Fixed Term Parliaments Act of 2011. The government had finished its main legislative programme within 4 years, leaving the 5th year up to the general election in May without much for MPs to do. The Labour Party accused the government of having run out of ideas, a zombie government it was called, without any major legislation and no big debates. Of course, leaving MPs time to devote to select committees. 8th objection is a line of criticism once much expressed by narrow-minded and envious Puritans, and by those who aren't yet assuaged by the recent restrictions on MPs' expenses claims, and that is their tendency to go on foreign travels. Well, the most vivid example is Gerald Kaufman's Culture, Media and Sport Committee, which provoked much wry amusement as it went to Hollywood, touring the studios, meeting celebrities, to learn about the film industry. Now, if anybody knows Kaufman, you'll know he's a film buff. Frequently see him at the BFI on the South Bank. Well, he was in his second heaven. Now, all members of his committee went to Seattle, San Francisco and Los Angeles. They were inquiring into audio-visual communications and the regulation of broadcasting, 1998. The committee went to Greece and Italy to explore the illicit trade in antiquities, 2000, and then to Malaysia and Australia to look at the staging of international sporting events. Other trips took the committee to Las Vegas, Lisbon, Paris and Brussels. Now the chairman, Gerald, he wondered what the fuss was about. He said nobody paid us any attention when we went to Wigan last year as part of an inquiry into rugby football. Another later example was the then Select Committee on the Office of Deputy Prime Minister, Prescott, which in 2004, in its quest to find out about local government and inner cities, visited Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, soon after examining business improvement districts in San Francisco. The Evening Standard of the 9th of November 2004 called such jollies a world tour junket. The 9th, this is a much more serious criticism, is that select committees have contributed to a centralisation of power. They have investigated the responsibilities of elected local authorities and invariably recommend the imposition of national standards and controls, central regulations and reporting obligations, thus increasing the interventionist tasks of departments and civil servants constraining local government. They rarely recommend that central government should stop doing something. Rather, they wanted to do more. The irony is that select committees that were set up ostensibly to be a counterweight to central government have enhanced its role. This process of centralisation undermines local accountability, making it appear as if local authorities are accountable to committees of one of the Houses of Parliament and not to their own voters. The constitutional context now, the constitutional tradition that's reflected in my article in today's lecture, and my earlier one to you, was that the role of the House of Commons was not to be a counterweight to the government, but an arena for contending views, above all, between the contending political parties, between the government and opposition. The primacy of this political struggle explains why a select committee report that isn't unanimous or one the government disagrees with will be pigeonholed, and why able and ambitious MPs still mostly prefer not to serve on them but to play a more visible role in the chamber and on standing now public bill committees. Our citizens have never voted for MPs to serve on select committees and perform the role of scrutiny. I often ask MPs whether during their election campaigns they had included in their electoral manifestos, addresses and speeches the promise that if elected they would engage in scrutiny on select committees. And I've asked a number of MPs that question. No one has ever answered yes. Select committees are often justified as a means to carry out the important function of the House of Commons of scrutiny of the executive. But where did the notion of the House of Commons as a scrutinising body come from? Books before the 1960s had used the word when discussing standing committees to scrutinise details of proposed legislation, or of occasional select committees when scrutinising administration and implementation by civil servants, but never policy. Originally in Latin, scrutiny was about picking over and sorting rags, not bits and pieces, not broad policy. Now, reformers, like the Study of Parliament group, cleverly extended the term to cover the role of the House as a whole and to select committees as if they were microcosms of the whole House. But in the whole House, from the 18th century onwards, had grown up on the benches opposite the government the opposition, whose role was to oppose the government. Advocates of select committees seem to want them to perform the functions of the opposition. That's why I accuse them of undermining the dynamics of the Constitution. The future, the modernising reformers are not content. Their latest campaign document is a report of the House of Commons Liaison Committee of the 8th of November 2012. This report wants departmental select committees to invade the role of the Public Accounts Committee by paying more attention to the cost of politics and how departments ensure they offer good value for money. It wants them also to extend their scrutiny to other organisations. It recommends they should appoint rapporteurs to lead inquiries, to use specialised advisors to question witnesses and commission external research. They can't trust the MPs to do that, so let's have some extras in to do it, and to broaden the range of their witnesses. The chairs of select committee and their staff are said to need more accommodation and infrastructure. This is just rampant empire building. These changes would indeed lead to the establishment of the counter-bureaucracy feared by Morrison, acting as a pseudo-government to rival the real government. Now, ironically, some proposals from that report seem to admit that serving on select committees didn't come naturally to MPs, since it recommended that more effort needs to be put into the induction and continuing professional development of committee members who need trainers to develop their questioning skills. Even committee chairs needed guidelines. So select committee work doesn't arise easily and spontaneously as a role of elected representatives. It's artificial and a distraction from their more important roles. Now, I'm not a lone voice. There may be signs of support gathering for my sceptical view. In 2013, Adam Lent, Director of Programme at the Royal Society of Arts, wrote a piece, and it's on the LSE's British Policy and Politics blog, entitled "Select Committees Are Becoming the Ugly Face of Parliament. It's time to rein them in." He was worried that some committees have come to see their job as holding the wider world to account, and hence the hostile grilling of people who hold no governmental role. He was concerned at the style of questioning, claiming select committees had become public courts where individuals are tried not on the veracity of their case, but on how well they managed to perform in the committee room bear pit. A second bit of support for me comes from an insightful article by Crystal Coote from King's College and our own Martin Lodge in 2013, in which they discuss the extension of select committee activity into the work of independent regulatory agencies like Oftel, Ofcom, Ofgem and the now defunct FSA, all of which were deliberately established to be beyond the scope of political and select committee inquiries. Coote and Lodge consider the emergence now of the phenomenon of two principles, the Secretary of State and the Select Committee, and the undermining of the authority of the government to control its agent and achieve its policies. They raise the prospect that independent regulators might be turned into creatures of Parliament. They call for more discussion of the implications of extending parliamentary involvement in control over what was supposed to be independent agencies. I might also interject here, I was very uneasy about the calling of Sir John Chilcot before a committee to explain why there was a delay. But such independent committees are set up to be independent and not to have to be subject to political investigation. Now, aren't they useful, these select committees? Yes. So as not to be wholly negative, I admit that select committees have contributed something of value. And I did write a review of Gavin Drury's volume in 1985 on select committees, where I observed, and I still believe that this is what they've achieved, just to show that I'm not wholly negative. They have illuminated the background to many policy problems, both long and short term, by conducting investigations of policy analysis. They've brought together evidence from a range of views, providing opportunities for many groups to express their arguments, and in this way they have helped shape the climate of informed opinion about critical issues. They've constituted a forum for the exchange of ideas and their testing. In their monitoring of the work of departments, they've carried out administrative oversight of civil servants, thus making them more accountable. The possibility that the random gaze of a committee may probe into any part of the department keeps civil servants alert to the need to be able to justify their actions before Parliament. I thought that was a highly important role, and the pity was there wasn't enough of it. Although I stick to what I wrote 30 years ago, I still think that on balance, the demerits of departmental select committees outweigh their merits. So what would I change? I do have a reforming agenda myself. I advocate reforms to bring departmental select committees more into alignment with British constitutional and political traditions. One, there's four, their terms of reference need revising. In 1989, I called for them to drop the examination of policy and of ministers, and to confine themselves to the administration of policy as the Public Accounts Committee used to before recent weeks and months under Margaret Hodge as the chairman. With a sharper focus, they could probe more deeply into departments and the work of civil servants and produce more effective reports that would help change the behaviour and culture of officials. A recent report by the Public Administration Select Committee, remember that's across departments, looking at them all, focusing on the civil service. It produced a tremendous report recently called Truth to Power, How Civil Service Reform Can Succeed. And it contains a set of devastating criticisms of the civil service, which the committee said needed fundamental reform. Select committees more focused on the activities of civil servants would be a practical way of achieving change in their attitudes and behaviour in their culture. Secondly, rather than engage in pre-legislative scrutiny, select committees should concentrate on post-legislative scrutiny, exploring whether legislation is working as Parliament intended. 3, parties in the Commons should build up their own party committees of MPs to help formulate policy, in including on these party committees their MPs who are ministers or frontbenchers. These committees could keep a closer check on their ministers in government and ensure that the elected representatives of the people played a more constructive role in making party policy and watching over the performance of their party's ministers. Such party committees are more appropriate locations for analysis and discussion of policy than across party select committees. Fourth, from the perspective of both the right and the left, there are better counterweights to excessive central executive power than beefed up select committees. If you're on the right, there's privatisation and the promotion of markets in both the public and private sectors. If you're on the left, And for me, best of all, decentralisation to elected local government. And I suppose if you're a new Labour Blairite still, you could combine both these approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now,
will you repeat the question for me, please?
No, we have to repeat the questions for the... Now, a very distinct view about select committees. And I should declare an interest because I've acted as advisor for select committees and therefore fit one of the subcategories earlier described to some extent. But can I begin by opening out the question by saying, surely, because you believe in traditional sovereignty of Parliament, Parliament's capacity to do what, at some level, it wishes to do. And this is something that Parliament itself has wished to do. All of this is activity. MPs themselves voted into action. They created the select committees after the Norman St John Stevens report in 1979. They have changed the terms of reference subsequently. MPs sit on the committees and they vote now both the chairs and the members of the committee. So surely this is simply an expression of parliamentary sovereignty.
Well, parliamentary sovereignty isn't just what one chamber of the House does or what one committee of the House does. Parliamentary sovereignty, as I said in my initial lecture, consists of the Crown, the government, House of Lords, House of Commons, the three together. And I think the select committees were foisted on the MPs by the government, a new government that didn't know what was what. They had been out of government for years. And it wasn't long before ministers realised they'd made a mistake. And I agree with you. Many MPs like it. They like them. Gives them something to do. But surely one's entitled to take a more reflective, longer-term, wider-range view of the Constitution and the governmental constitutional arrangements, and not allow one house to run away with itself, because one house should not claim that it is sovereign.
Okay, then, well, let's come into this another way. I mean, the truth is that if you invert your criticisms of the select committee system, you would really end, and it's pretty clear from what you were saying at the end, what you'd have instead would be the opposition opposing the government.
Well, that's its job. That's why it came into being.
I understand that the opposition's job is to oppose the government, but that would mean the only opportunity potentially to do this, to do that kind of challenge and oversight, would be on the floor of the House?
Yes.
And
it would revitalise the floor.
And would it not, however, be very hard to do all of the things that Parliament now feels it needs to do from the floor of the House of Commons? I mean, it would be very, very... Would you accept the Public Accounts Committee as a committee to oversee the government's retrospectively, to look at the way the government has spent money on delivering its policy?
Well, the Public Accounts Committee was my model until Margaret Hodge distorted it. It was my model of what an ideal select committee would be, focusing not on policy, but on the way policy had been carried out,
right,
on implementation, and focusing really on civil servants, and only calling in outside people to give evidence if they were investigating, the working of central government departments. Well, as you know, she's widened the range of her Public Accounts Committee. I'm looking back on the traditional Public Accounts Committee. That was my model, and that's how I would like the select committees to behave. As I said, eliminating scrutiny of ministers and policy.
But risk of, and I'll open this up for questions in a moment, but I mean, the risk of Mrs. Hodge is a very, I mean, next week we have the Conservative number 2 on that committee speaking about the Public Accounts Committee. Now, it would be hard to argue with the proposition, would it not, that Margaret Hodge and the current Public Accounts Committee have taken the complex business of scrutinising government out to the public, that they understand it in a way they never understood it before, even, you know, pursuing tax dodging via the public account, via the scrutiny of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, which is how it's been done, has opened up a complex public policy issue to a much wider gaze than if it had been done in the traditional way.
Well, I thought still a great success story of Margaret Hodge's Public Accounts Committee is the way it did focus on the failures of government departments to deal with tax evasion, avoidance. He gets them mixed up. But what has particularly angered me is her statement that she wants to conduct deep dives into the expenditure of local authorities. Now, it seems to me she's got no right. No select committee has the right to interfere in how local authorities operate. And I condemn, of course, Communities and Local Government Committee for wanting to investigate how Rotherham mismanaged child abuse. I argue that in our constitution, local authorities are accountable to their own voters. They are not accountable to the House of Commons, and certainly not to one committee of the House of Commons. And I think it's deplorable that local authorities agreed to attend.
Okay, chance to, yes, I'll take the microphone across and we'll...
So, when you were talking about the introduction of select committees in 1979, you used the quote that it was a reflection and a nostalgia for the Victorian age with fluctuating majorities in the Commons.
No, that was me.
That was you, there we go. Most of what we've learned on this course is that the British government's fundamentally changing, the two-party system's under strain, further devolution to Scotland, the unwritten constitution is arguably very shaky. Surely this whole model of select committees focusing only on, after the event, well, not even scrutiny, administrative functions is really only applicable to a two-party system from about 1945 to 1960, where now actually there's disillusionment with politicians, there's a desire for reform. Margaret Hodge is one of the most popular politicians in the country, and actually there's a general view that we can't just hold our politicians accountable with elections every 5 years, and actually there needs to be this inbuilt scrutiny of the executive, although obviously you detest the word scrutiny of the executive, but I mean it seems to be in tune with other changes in British government. So
yeah,
you got all of that.
I've heard that.
Right, okay.
You've put that case very well. I hear that from many of my former colleagues at LSE. Patrick Dunleavy, Simon Hicks, that there's been... Well, this is why the next election is so important. We'll see whether the old system will return or whether we're going to be in a new game, a game that perhaps will require us to look back into the 19th century, into the mid-19th century, when there wasn't a clear two-party system. And I admit all that, it is all up for grabs.
And indeed, I mean, not to interrupt you, but I mean, it is a really cool question because
yeah, it is.
You can see how I do think the early to middle 19th century is a potential way of looking at it, as is the late 1970s. And although we're talking about select committees today, if you think about standing committees looking at legislation, particularly the finance bill, in the kind of, if we had a minority government without a formal coalition, I think it's right to say the government wouldn't be able to guarantee that it could win votes in committees at all.
Yep.
And that would be a very big change, and it precisely points to the interesting cornucopia of possibility that potentially the decline of the two-party system offers.
If it's declined. We'll see.
Okay, there's one over here.
Really two questions. I think one's an example of the other, though. You mentioned the kangaroo court nature of select committees, and I guess I was kind of tangentially caught up in one of those working for one of the companies that you mentioned. So my question is, apart from reputational risk, what power does the select committee have to get people from, let's say, a company with nothing to do with government to appear? And I guess the second more important question is, what actual power do these select committees actually have in reality, other than reputational or publicity?
You're right, they haven't got any powers other than they make their report always to the full House. The government has 2 months in which to reply, again reported to the whole House, and then it's up to the whole House. If they feel that penalties are necessary, they could fine, they can call the miscreants to the bar, the floor of the House, and give them a dressing down. They could send them to the Tower, which, as I understand it, is not the Tower of London.
Tower inside the House of Commons.
It's the tower inside the Commons, where Big Ben is? The cells are there, so they could be sent there. But that would be a judgment of the whole House. The Select Committee has only got the force of its report.
Okay, so in reality, if Company X was called to appear before a Select Committee...
As the craft people were, and the boss refused to come. Right. So what?
Yeah.
Nothing happened to her.
No.
I mean,
but the others were so spineless they weren't prepared to stand up.
Sure.
I mean, it's worth adding that the committees produce reports, and there is I think a protocol, an agreement that government departments respond to those reports within a fixed time.
2 months, I think it is.
2 months. But there is no requirement for the government to respond positively. They just are under a requirement to respond. It's an agreement, really. It's not a legal requirement to respond. It's a protocol. Yeah. Is that right?
Yeah. What I would suggest is there's a super research project looking at the government's responses to select committees. These are all available on the web, and you can compare them with what the original recommendation was, and you see the various phrases and tactics used by the government to escape from what the select committees are telling them to do.
But it is very much the power of the authority of the House of Commons, and that's one. I mean, as I have worked as an advisor for select committees, and I certainly remember at a time when, in fact, there wasn't a majority for the government at the time, and the particular chair of that committee used to say to the clerks and advisors, I want reports that are politically interesting but not politically difficult. I mean, that is that they had to be able to get through the system without there being a vote, because select committee chairs don't like votes on reports, but in the end it couldn't be so controversial it wouldn't go through. And that, you can see, is an inevitable consequence of balanced committees or ones without a majority.
And you can see that well illustrated in when a report comes out it's the back pages, isn't it? where you have the meetings of the committee to consider the report or sections of the report, and you can see sometimes there are many votes taken, and you can say automatically, well, that's goodbye to that report. Other ones in which there aren't any divisions are much more listened to and paid attention to by government.
Any further questions? Yes, do. Right.
Oh yeah. Question's not yet fully formed in my mind, but just bear with me. If you change the select committees the way that you said, to give them more sort of focus and hold civil servants more responsible for delivery, would it politicise the civil service in a sense that they would be constantly having to defend themselves against the MPs? And to sort of illustrate that point, what I'd say is we had a lecture here about policy writing a couple of weeks ago, and policy, in that man's view, was quite clearly divided into the heroic and the mundane. I've thought about that, and the heroic seems to be MPs standing up saying, we'll do this, it's a fantastic thing, and then the mundane is the civil servants trying to implement the policy in what can sometimes be a very, very complex environment, and that's kind of the sticking point for the delivery of some policies, that they might be perfect academically, but when you actually come to deliver them in the real world, that's where the issues lie. And if you constantly have the civil servants being scrutinised by the MPs in this very specific way that you've mentioned, that could cause a lot of issues.
Yes, but I don't want the civil servants to be scrutinised about policy. If they're questioned about policy and say, for example, their policy advice to ministers, their correct answer, in my mind, is, oh, that's a question you must put to ministers, because ministers are responsible for policy. The civil servants are responsible for administering, implementing that policy. And that's what I want my select committees, with their new terms of reference, to be focusing on, not dealing with the tricky policy issues. And if they keep off that, as for instance the Public Accounts Committee has done throughout its existence, keeping away from policy and focusing only on the administration of policy, that shouldn't give rise to the sorts of problems you're worried about, because the civil servants haven't got themselves involved in political partisan issues.
Well, but still, okay, so perhaps partisan issues isn't quite the correct way to, perhaps it wouldn't lead to a politicisation of the civil service. Perhaps, I'll preface this by saying it wasn't fully formed. But does that, it seems to me that reflecting on that lecture that we did have, there's that constant struggle between the idea that's been articulated by a minister and its delivery by the civil service, and that's where I would see the issue coming, that some of the ideas, they might be good ideas but they can't be delivered.
Who's made these heroic policy statements?
Ministers might make a statement, and then the civil servants would then have to carry it out, implement it. But they're connected. It's the implementation of that policy.
Well, it depends if the minister is acting in his or her capacity as the head of a department, or if they're out in the sticks, although they are always supposed to be acting with a ministerial hat on. But if they make informal remarks, commitments, as they're doing at the moment, as a prelude to the election, in their campaigning mode, that could happen. And civil servants are faced then with deciding, what do we do? Their role is to serve the minister in his governmental official capacity. I don't think the civil servants have a role in protecting the minister from off-the-cuff remarks that don't represent government views. There is a problem, and this is now with the coalition government, in that ministers are saying different things. This has been the bad effect of the coalition on the key concept of cabinet collective responsibility. That is a problem. But civil servants, particularly, well, the top ones, the sorts who are likely to appear before select committees, are usually very adept at keeping their mouths shut when they know that this would really embarrass the minister. And if you want to check the minister for saying these remarks that you find inappropriate, the place to raise that is in the chamber, or I suppose they could use what's come to be more prominent in the last 10 years or so, the Westminster Hall meetings, where you can have backbenchers can raise issues and have a debate with the minister who said it. So there are other opportunities than select committees for MPs to get at the minister who's gone off the rails.
Can I just take one final, we can finish in a moment, but just one point you made about, you described the liaison committee, which is the committee which consists of the chairs of all the other select committees. So it's all the select committees, and as you say, they have the Prime Minister of the day in twice a year.
Yeah.
And I think I heard you say that this has contributed to the increasingly presidential nature of the office of Prime Minister. But two things. One is, I'm assuming the Prime Minister agrees to go and doesn't have to go. There's no legal requirement for them to go. And second, the way, if you think about it, it sounds like almost a collusion. That is, that the Prime Minister presumably wants to feel presidential, and appearing in front of the Select Committee makes them feel like that. So actually, it's good for both of them. What's wrong with that analysis?
Well, I agree that that's the process.
What's wrong with it being presidential?
It was all instituted under Tony Blair, who felt he could run rings round the liaison committee and the chairman and their inept questioning, and he was right. He did. Others haven't been as good.
Well, what's the problem there with the presidential nature, though? I mean, prime ministers are you've written this. Sometimes prime ministers are presidential. Sometimes they're more like committee chairs. But you know, what's wrong if it allows them to be a bit more presidential? Is that an element? There's a problem with that?
Well, I've long been opposed to anything that enhances the idea that we have a presidential system. I believe our system is essentially collective cabinet responsibility with the Prime Minister chair primus inter pares. So that's my model of what is the right way for the British Constitution to operate. And I deplore anything that makes it look as if the Prime Minister has to answer for every department. It's a problem with question time too. I think the present question time,
you mean
the PMQs, the Wednesday gladiatorial contest with the leader of the opposition having 6 questions that he can throw at the Prime Minister. This makes it look as if the Prime Minister is responsible for everything that goes on in every department. And it damages and undermines the collective system and also individual ministerial responsibility, the ministers being responsible for their own departments. In times past with PMQs, Prime Ministers wouldn't accept questions that could be sent to another department. The clerks in the House processing the questions wouldn't allow them to be asked. and they would send them to the Minister of Transport or Social Security or what have you. And Prime Ministers wouldn't allow themselves to be sucked into matters that were matters for the other ministers. But that's gone. And I admit that, Tony Blair enjoyed that because he was good at it.
But I mean,
and liked it. So he encouraged this presidentialisation. Gordon Brown continued it. Cameron has continued it.
But with sort of 24-hour TV, media scrutiny, you might argue that this would happen anyway, and that this form of analysis of the Prime Minister is fit for purpose in this kind of world.
Yeah, well, my advice to Prime Ministers and the press people who have advised him, is don't allow the media to dominate your agenda. You're Prime Minister of the whole country. Why should Murdoch or Dacre dictate what you as Prime Minister, as head of the government, is doing? I'm very uneasy about how people kowtow to the media setting our political agenda. And Prime Ministers, could say no. What right have you got to drag me into this? I don't have to be accountable 24 hours a day, 8 days a week. They have allowed, and you're right, yes, they have contributed to this. They like the enhancement of their power. They like to feel that they are presidential in the sense of being able to control all government. I look back in the 19th century to Robert Peel in the 1840s, who had similar views. He wanted to control everything. In the 1840s, he tried to, and had a nervous breakdown. It was too much for him. Now, if that is what happened in the 1840s, why, so many decades later, do we expect a Prime Minister to be in control of everything that government does?
Okay,
and what every department does?
We probably ought to stop here unless any further questions in which... Yes, very briefly, take one quick final question. We must be short now because we'll be thrown out, to move out in a second.
Thank you very much for this. It's very interesting. We have a lot of loose ends in government from Magna Carta up till now. Would it be possible for somehow, maybe it's just a wishful thinking, for this Parliament of MPs and Prime Minister, everybody, after May election, start by looking at what has passed, education in everybody, because none of them seems to be getting it quite right. So could it be a situation where people start learning about what they're supposed to be doing for the next 5 years until the next general election? It doesn't matter who wins this time.
Well, it's a good question. I mean, with the radical change that may well come about with the possibility of an unusual, complicated general election result, to simplify the question, is there an opportunity ever to reset the rules, to reset the underlying rules for the way we do the Constitution, the way the British Constitution works?
Well, for numerous years, there has been a campaign to have a written constitution. And one of the select committees, Political Constitutional Reform Committee under Graham Allen, has produced reports, and a big report on having a written constitution or a codified constitution. Our old friend Vernon Bogdanor, now at King's College, who's written extensively on the Constitution, has just produced yet another pamphlet advocating that we have a written constitution. The Leader of the Opposition, Ed Miliband, has proposed that we have a constitutional convention after the election that can look at, primarily the tangled issues over devolution, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England, and other matters, I suppose. You could have a Royal Commission on the Constitution. I think doing that, following your agenda, having that sort of inquiry would occupy people's time. It would give academics great opportunities to write pamphlets and books, and in the end, nothing would happen.
Right, we have to finish there on that slightly glum note. Thank you very much. Next week we will hear from a parliamentarian about the operation of one of the select committees, the Public Accounts Committee. That's Richard Bacon MP, and indeed the recently mentioned Vernon Bognor will be speaking on the final week's lecture about general elections. Other than that, thank you all for coming. Any of you who are around tomorrow night, there is a British government event focused on the general election, looking at higher education funding and student funding, and the evening after, one on London, both in Clement House. Other than that, thank you very much. See you next week, I hope. Goodbye.